Winter gardening may not be popular like growing through the spring, but my Texas winter vegetable garden can be a productive and refreshing scene change from the heat of summer. Over the last 15 years, I've learned what crops grow best and specific techniques for extending the season. Can you really grow food through freezing weather? I'm going to break it all down and discuss my favorite winter vegetables to grow at home, how to keep them productive, and more of the best winter garden tips. I'm Scott from New Garden Road, always out here to inform, inspire, and elevate you. Encouraging biodiversity and restoring habitat is my mission, one garden at a time. I want to start the video off by talking about some of my favorite winter vegetables to grow. Nutrient-dense leafy greens such as kale, spinach, lettuce, and Asian greens come in a variety of colors and textures. This really makes for a beautiful and vibrant garden. And if you ask me, I think they taste good. Kale is one of my favorite superfoods, and when it comes to kale, I've really gotten stuck on the dazzling blue, the rainbow dino, and the curly roja. I also grow the scarlet kale. These are some really nice looking plants, and you'll get some variation from one plant to the next, meaning one's maybe more purple, one's a little bit more violet or blue, and the leaf shape can be a little bit different. Some are a little bit more ruffled or curled. I really feel like this makes it easier to stay engaged with my garden produce throughout the season. I can grow these for 6 or 7 months sometimes. And when it comes to homegrown spinach, you just can't beat it. The flavor, the texture. I always like to grow some giant spinach. You've got some really large leaves. It makes it really easy to get out there and just pick a few, and you've got something you can cook with pretty quickly. Likewise, I'll grow a traditional such as the Bloomsdale or some other smaller variety of spinach. And I really like to grow a lot because spinach in particular, it takes a while to get going. It's slow to germinate, and it's slow to really get to the point where you can begin to harvest from it. If you have the space to say grow 30 to 40 plants, then once they all begin to harvest, you're going to have a meal every time you harvest. The options for the lettuce that you can grow in your garden is truly endless, and this year I'm growing 14 varieties. I really love making lettuce wraps with other garden grown produce such as radishes, maybe some avocado, and an herb dressing. Asian greens is such a general term that applies to a wide variety of crops. You've got pak choi, bok choy, tatsoi, so many others. This year I'm growing a red komatsuna, and it looks so nice. I can't wait to eat this. All of those leafy greens that I just mentioned are generally hardy to the upper 20s, meaning they can take 27, 28 degrees, probably unprotected, no problem. However, I'm going to come back around to that. I definitely recommend that you protect them, but they are certainly able to withstand a light freeze, and in many cases that will make them sweeter because they'll take some of the sugars from the roots, bring it up into the leaves. It's kind of like antifreeze. When they have a higher concentration of sugar in the leaves as opposed to water, they're going to be less likely to be damaged by any frost, and subsequently you get some sweeter greens. And this will also bring out the color. If you've got some red leaf lettuces, Asian greens, or kale, you'll notice that the color will really come on after some cold weather. And it's also clear from my photo archives that I love growing broccoli. Over the past couple of years, I've increased the number that I typically grow from 10 to 20, and this year I'm on my way to 25. I really feel like this is a vegetable that just keeps on giving. A lot of times we're focused on that big broccoli crown. It's like a trophy. However, side shoots are where it's at. You're going to get several rounds of side shoots if you take care of your plants and keep feeding them. And don't forget about those broccoli leaves. They can really sweeten up after a frost, and they are super nutritious. There really are some beautiful broccolis out there. Some of my favorites are the gypsy, the burgundy. Solstice was really nice. I did that a couple of years ago. And my winter garden wouldn't be complete without an abundance of carrots. I'm talking about 10 or 12 varieties. Carrots are one that take a long time to get ready. We're going to talk about it later, but they're going to grow slower over the winter. It can take 3 or 4 months. There are some varieties that will mature faster than others, and if you do successive plantings with a bunch of different varieties, you'll get a cascade of carrots. Homegrown garlic and onion are a staple in my kitchen throughout the year. Typically we plant the garlic here in late November, and it will be harvested in about the middle of May. Onions are planted later in about January here in Central Texas, and you want to plant those from slips, and they will also mature sometime in May. These can be cured and stored, and you'll have them throughout the summer, going into the fall, and you can preserve them in different ways to take advantage throughout the year. Now let's talk about how we keep the garden productive throughout the winter. Planting is key. One point that I think is really important to understand is sun exposure as it relates to the shorter days of winter. Your vegetable crops aren't really getting as much sun as they would in the spring or even in the summer. You can grow these types of crops in Colorado or Wisconsin through the summer when you've got really long days, the sun is high in the sky, and your your crops will grow like crazy. But here in Central Texas, you've got shorter days, you've got that sun lower on the horizon, and that's a key factor in how vigorously your plants will grow. So you need to be patient, and when you see a listing for the average days to harvest, you need to remember they're going to take a little bit more time, maybe 2 weeks or more. Weather trends will also play a role in this. If you've got cloudy conditions for an extended period of time, your plants will grow, they're just going to be growing more slowly. Remember those elements now as we move on to interplanting concepts. One approach that I always emphasize to my clients is to visualize the garden at maturity, and this means understanding how big and how much space the individual plants you're growing will take up. You want to plant taller plants on the north side because the sun is going to be on the southern side of your garden. If you plant taller plants on the south side, they're going to block the sun from any lower growing plants. That's why if you're growing kale or broccoli, some of the taller winter vegetables, they need to be on the north side of the garden or in a specific location where they're not crowding out any others. But there are some techniques that you can employ and interplant them with other crops. Here's my second planting of broccoli. I've got 10 plants growing. I started these from seed in early October. If you'll notice on the right side of this raised bed, I've got about 4 inches of spacing, and in this strip I seeded a variety of small radishes, and I was able to fit in 96 radishes. They're on the east side of this bed. They should mature in the next 4 weeks or so before these broccoli get enough height and width on them that would cause their growth to slow. So that's a good interplanting technique. I like the French breakfast, the white icicle, sparkler white tip, and then I've got an Easter egg mix here. So a lot of variety, a lot of fun. Here's an example of the exact same technique, but at a mature state. I've got 10 broccoli plants growing. I put these in October and they are all mature now, so I began to harvest them. But I just want you to see they've got the space to grow and the light to grow underneath the cover of this broccoli. I did the same thing here on the west side, and I've got some larger variety radishes growing, some daikon, some watermelon, some black Spanish. That's one reason why I typically group my more long-standing crops all together in one place. Whether or not you have a container garden, a balcony, think about that as much as you can, because things like the garlic and the carrots are going to take a longer time to come to maturity, so they're going to need to have their own unique place. And if you've got something else growing there that's more fast maturing, then you're going to have some gaps, but it can be more difficult to interplant after the fact, because as things like carrots and garlic begin to grow, their foliage will shade out anything that you maybe try to seed or plant in after that. Here's another example that's a mixed planting, and this is where it's important to visualize the plants at their mature state. You can see there's nothing planted on the left or the right. That broccoli plant's going to get really big and take up all that space. The delphinium, snapdragon, and then here's a mizuna. That's going to get about like that. Tatsoi, Kamatsuna, Pak Choi. That's an example of interplanting with a bit more of a mix, some flowers. You just have to understand how big those plants are going to get, what that's going to look like. So many times when I'm interplanting in this style, I'll use some stakes to keep plants upright and so that they'll stay in their growing space. If you don't, sometimes, like you can kind of see with this snapdragon, it's starting to kind of, lean over. As the roots develop and it gets stronger, it'll be able to remain more upright. But in the meantime, you get a strong cold front that might lay down, start growing into the space of some of the other plants. Staking can be key in interplanting. You just have to control that growth and confine them to the space that you intend for them to grow in, and that way everything else will have enough room. I also want to emphasize the importance of fertilizing regularly. In general, there are 2 types of fertilizer: slow release granular fertilizer and liquid concentrated fertilizers. I use a lot of liquid fertilizer along with seaweed, which I'll be talking about later. After I put in new seedlings in the garden, I think a regular drench of liquid fertilizer is really going to help them get established, start to grow roots, and grow vigorously. But I do typically prepare the soil ahead of time with a slow release granular fertilizer. But for faster maturing crops such as lettuce, which you'll often use a cut and come again method or prune out the outer leaves selectively as they grow, a weekly application of liquid fertilizer will help them to regrow. While I will use a liquid fertilizer on my long-standing crops such as broccoli and kale and garlic, what I typically do is side dress them with a granular fertilizer every 4 to 6 weeks. This is going to be really good as they continue to grow for several months. If you do prefer using liquid fertilizer, I still advocate for adding a granular fertilizer ahead of each planting. Whichever one you choose, continue to apply apply them regularly. And just remember, as it relates to some of the faster growing crops like lettuce, if you give them a slow release fertilizer, it's going to take a couple of weeks before that to really break down and start to feed them. Consider adding some liquid fertilizer to your regimen. And now I want to talk about some indispensable season extending techniques such as hoop houses, frost cloth, and 40% shade cloth. I do think it's important to be ready ahead of time to provide optimal growing conditions for your plants. Here in Central Texas, oftentimes the weather will shift from warm to cold in the same week, and I'm talking about warm as in 85 degrees. So shade cloth is really important. It helps to keep the soil cooler, which will keep those plants growing in a more even keel fashion. And that's really important for these cool season plants because when the soil temperature warms up, that can trigger them to bolt and go to seed. In general, I utilize a 40% grade of shade cloth when temperatures trend 75 degrees or higher. This week we are trending in that direction, so I set up my hoop houses ahead of time and I put the 40% shade cloth over 8 raised beds. And on the other side we have heavy row cover. This helps plants make it through freezing temperatures. You will find some different grades of row cover. A lot of times it's light, medium, or heavy, and this corresponds to the amount of protection that it's going to be providing for your plants. Lightweight row cover really only gives you protection against insects, while the medium gives you around 6 or 8 degrees of protection, insulating them by that margin, and the heavy row cover can protect your plants by about 10 degrees, meaning that if it's 32 degrees outside, it should be about 42 degrees underneath that row cover. Throughout the day, even on cloudy days, the soil will be warmed by passive solar radiation. When you've got the row cover on top, that's trapping that ground heat, so overnight as things really cool off, you'll have a reserve of that heat trapped under that cover, and your plants will have more nominal growing conditions. A lot of times we think about frost and cold biting the plants physically on the leaves, and that's what happens, but also it's about the soil temperature. Just like I mentioned, when it's warm, triggering plants to bolt and go to seed. If the soil temperature gets too cold, you can have some irregularity in their growth. Last winter I experienced this for the first time, but we had below average temperatures in January and February, and my root crops such as radishes didn't form a bulb at all. They actually just bolted. That's because they didn't have ideal growing conditions. So I think that makes the case for row cover, or frost cloth as we often refer to it as. It's not just for frost or freezing temperatures. If you got weather that trends 50 degrees or lower for an extended period of time, I would keep your row cover on. That's going to maintain that bubble around those plants, and that will really help the conditions be more sustainable for their growth. Along with sunlight and temperature, moisture is a really important element in plants development. Drip irrigation is my preferred method for watering my garden. It makes it really easy to get a slow, deep soaking, but I will water by hand as needed, particularly for newly planted seedlings as they don't have a really well-developed root system. The drip irrigation really comes in handy in order to protect plants from freezing temperatures. And on top of that, you want to make sure you've got a nice layer of mulch. Pine straw is my personal favorite, and I go for about 2 to 3 inches of mulch. I like to pull it out around the base of the plant so it's got some room to breathe, but that's going to help to retain soil moisture. It's also going to keep the soil temperature in a more nominal state, and it will also discourage any winter weeds from taking hold. You never want to leave your garden soil bare for extended periods of time. It can be necessary when you're direct seeding, but if you're leaving one of your garden beds empty for the season, add a thick layer of mulch or consider a cover crop. A couple of options that can withstand cold temperatures would be crimson clover and hairy vetch, and these will grow and develop to become a living mulch for your garden soil. And seaweed is an indispensable resource in my garden. It builds resilience in plants and it aids in stress relief. It's a key source for micronutrients and organic acids. This feeds soil microbes, and it also helps plants endure periods of extreme cold or heat. Am I recording? Yeah. Bingo. They coming. They're the best. Okay. You know, I'm doing something over here. Yeah. Excuse me. How we do? I've learned what crops grow best. Now check out more awesome gardening videos on my channel. Like this video and follow New Garden Road for weekly content. You can grow your own food. Keep it organic.